Okay. Um, the topic for today is logging. There are a couple of things that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to logging. One is configuring it and um, how to recommend the right settings, what these settings mean, if there are any things to keep in mind when it comes to setting the logging level, etc. And the other thing is how to actually read the logs, how to get information out of the logs. The logs can be very informative and very valuable, and they can also be completely useless, unfortunately, if they don't contain the right information. So it's very important to be able to extract as much information as possible because logs are only available after the fact, meaning you only need to look at the logs when you have a question to answer. That question often is a problem. Why did X happen or why didn't X happen? And by that time, it's already too late, right? And your hope is that the logs contain some information that you can go back and try and extract. And that's where they're most valuable. So by that time, you might have limited information. So um, let me actually start by looking at an actual log, and then we can go back and see how we can configure things. Even though that is slightly backwards, I want to do it that way because I want to make this practical and I want it to be hands on. So I'm going to use uh, uh, the logs that I'm generating here on my dev machine and the configuration that goes with it. So this is not a real scenario, but it is going to represent the logs. So the first thing to keep in mind is um, we log information that is supplementary, and it helps us understand. Um, can everybody mute? I'm sorry. Let's mute everyone. Thank you. Um, the supplementary information is information that is not directly related to any activity that the users are making, nor are they related to documents or anything specific to the product. They are information specific to either the configuration of the product or they are specific to the environment we're running in, meaning the hardware, the configuration, etc. So the first thing is that we always log when we start the time and the version number, and this is very important. In many cases, this information is left out of the logs that are shared. So one of the key things is to make sure that you know which version the log belongs to, because if we don't know the version number, then the logs can be misleading or we might make the wrong conclusions. So it is critical either to get this information from the logs, and that's the best place, by the way, because you know that uh, there is no room for error, right? If you see the version number in the logs, then you know this log was generated by this version. End of story. You have high confidence. We log it in more than one place, by the way. Here in the initialization, which is pretty much one of the very first lines. But we also, if you search for version, you will see that we log it again here, and here we have more information. We have the hash ID of the commit, and we also have the uh, system name and version number, right? So I'm running on Debian 12, and you can see this here very clearly. And again, this is very valuable information. So it's always important to know what version um, of the system is being used and what version of the product is being used. Right after that, and this is relatively new, we log the configuration, but we only log the configuration entries that are different from the default. So we added logic that basically says for every configuration entry, see if the value that we have in the configuration file, which by the way is logged here, because again, it's very important to know what configuration file is being loaded and where to find it. And that information is logged as well. We go through the file, and for every entry, we compare the value with the default value that we have. And if it is different, we log it here. So this is a compact form of the config. All the other entries, and there are many, by the way, they are the default, which means we can go and look at the default for this version, right? Because again, we add new entries and the defaults might change, although that's extremely rare. But there might be new entries in the config that new versions would have that this one is missing. So it's important to know which version we're talking about to know what the defaults are. And it's really critical to read this. It's not too long, but it is critical. Why? Because this tells you how this particular instance is configured. And let me give you a very simple example. Sometimes uh, an administrator would complain that a document wasn't quarantined, and there's a quarantine feature. You see it here, and what it does is it's a last resort if the if because of network issues or other reasons the storage is not available and uploading fails, we eventually have to give up trying to upload the document. And in that case, we have to put it in the quarantine so that the administrator can recover it. But we can only do that if the quarantine is configured correctly and enabled, right? Because if you don't enable it or if you don't configure it correctly, then it is useless, right? It's disabled. Now, if we don't see the quarantine settings here, then you can be sure it is disabled because that's the default. Why is that the default? Well, because we need the path to store the documents, and this path we don't know, right? And even if we assumed a default path, that path might not exist, or we might not have, we meaning the process, might not have access right to it, right? So you can't write to it. And all of that means that we can't have a default value that enables this, right? And if it is not configured, if we don't see it here, then it is not enabled. But there's another way also of knowing if the quarantine is enabled or not. If I search for quarantine, I will find more information about it. And again, this is why it's very important to have this beginning of the log because it tells us a lot about the instance, how it is configured, and what is enabled, what isn't enabled, and what succeeded, what failed. So, as an example, you see here it says quarantine path is this path, all right, and then it tries to make sure that this directory exists, and we initialize, and it gives us information about the other settings, the maximum size, the age, and again, where are these coming from? They're coming from here, right? Either the default values or the overwritten values. And what is really important is that if the quarantine um, fails to be enabled, you will read it in the logs. So all of this, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back just to make sure you see the whole thing in one screen. You see here, we did actually find some quarantine files, and we we list them and we do the cleanup. All right, and in the end, we say that we found 3 quarantine files, and this is the total size. Okay, so all of this information is very important because this tells you that the quarantine is enabled. Whereas if for example this directory where the path of the quarantine is, if we can't create it, if it is invalid, right, then it's going to say error, and it's going to say quarantine is disabled. You see? So it's very important to know what the state of the configuration is and what the state of the process is, the service is, right? It doesn't it's not enough to know, for example, that the quarantine is enabled. You also have to know if it was valid and if it was actually enabled at runtime, not just in the config. And again, this is a very common. The reason I'm mentioning this because this is a very, very common issue. Um, if we quickly go to the configuration file, the XML, and we search for quarantine, we see that there is a quarantine files here. This is the where the setting is, and we see that there is an enable value here, right? It is not enough to have this true, because if you do this without setting the path, which by the way is here, which you can see is empty, yeah, then your quarantine is not enabled, and you will see in the logs that it is not enabled. Now, um, I'm sure you're wondering, well, if the config says it's disabled and the path isn't set, how come we see in the log that it is enabled? Well, the reason for that is because this is a development instance, and I do change the config for the instance I'm running, and I'm going to show you how I do that. Um, I do that by passing these command line arguments. This is not done in a real production scenario, but the reason I do it like this is because I'm testing, right? So I'm going to show you what happens if enabled is true, but the path is not set. And to do that, I'm going to delete it. Okay, so now the path is not set, and I'm going to run it again. But before I do, I want to make sure that we agree that here we see in the log that the quarantine path is set to this path. Okay. Now, when I run it again, first of all, let me quit. I'm going to run it again, and we should see at the beginning of the log that indeed we do not have the path. And if we don't have the path, actually, let me do it like this, just to make sure that the capitalization is not an issue. You see, it says quarantine path is set to blank. It says quarantine, and it's a warning. And now we can actually learn more about logging. Every log entry has a level, and warning is, as it implies, it's a serious issue that we think needs attention. And we say warning quarantining is enabled via the quarantine files config, but no path is set in the quarantine files.path. And it says clearly that it is disabling quarantine, right? And again, this is how you read the logs. You read the logs by seeing what is expected, in this case, based on the configuration, and then you compare it with what actually is happening at runtime. It's not enough to know that the config says X. You also have to see if X is valid and if it was effective, right? And here we see that quarantine is disabled. It really doesn't matter that it is set to enabled in the config because it is misconfigured. This is a configuration issue, okay? So this was an example for a very common scenario, but there are others. So let's actually go through them quickly. Um, if we go back to the config here, you will see that the storage settings and indeed the network settings are missing. There aren't much. So you see here the frame ancestor is set, which actually this is deprecated. It's not important. You see a couple of settings here for the WOPI host. Again, it's not that interesting, which means that they are set to the default. But you will see at startup, because this is very important, we do log um, the allowed host names and IP addresses for the trusted storage. So again, if you're in doubt as to what is allowed and how the system is configured or misconfigured, because maybe these defaults are invalid. If you know, for example, that in your case or the case you are investigating, there is a host name and maybe there is a private network, or maybe there is a different topology, then you should expect that these values to be extended or changed, right? And if you don't see that, then that might hint that maybe there would be network related failures. And this is how you marry basically the expectation by knowing something about the environment with the actual configuration from the logs. And that will inform you as to what might be going on, especially if later on you see failures because of communications. Like, for example, you might see, DNS lookup failed. Right, and you go like, okay, there's something wrong with the DNS. Then that's what we need to do. You fire off maybe an email, sysadmin, please check your DNS settings. Okay, the DNS settings is probably not the problem. the prob the problem probably is that there is a misconfiguration here. So you start from here. You figure out what is expected. You figure out what is the what is allowed, what is not allowed, the topology, and then if you think that yes, there might be an issue elsewhere, that's when you can investigate that separately. Okay, um, I want to go back to the basics of logging again, because I don't want us to lose sight of the main topic, which is logging. Logging uh, is fairly complex, unfortunately, because of various reasons, and I want you to be aware of some of these complexities. By the way, if you have any questions, maybe you should interrupt me, because I don't want to talk for too long when you are thinking about a question. So maybe this is a good time to pause and see if you have any questions. No? Okay. If you have any questions at any point, please ask. And I hope this is, I mean, my hope is that it is useful information. But if it is known information, that's fine as well, right? And maybe at the end you have some tips and some stuff that you want to share with everyone, and that would be cool as well. So um, the logging um, includes vital information. So let me really quickly go through this information and then tell you some subtleties that might not be obvious, especially if you're troubleshooting, okay, or reading the log. First, every log entry starts with a three letter that tells you which domain is logging. We have three domains. One is WSD, and this is the main service, and it is called cool WSD here. Okay. The second domain is the forkit, and it starts with FRK, and this is a process that spawns um, the processes that will load the documents, right? So all its responsibilities are limited to creating a new copy of the environment, of the process that loads documents, and this is separate from WSD, which is the service that listens to incoming connections, and it is the service that communicates with the browsers, the clients. And the last but not least domain is the kit, which second here. And the kit is an actual process that is either ready to load a new document or it has a document loaded in it. So these are the three domains, and it's very important to know which domain you the log you're reading belongs to. Um, if the document is not loaded yet, you will see that here in this brackets, and I will explain what the brackets are. It says spare. But before we get to that, let's see what other information is here. Um, After the dash, there's a number, and this number is the process ID. After that, it's the thread ID, which means wherever you read this number, that those logs are coming from the same process. With the small caveat that if you're looking at logs from different days, or maybe somebody restarted the cool WSD service, these numbers can get reused. So keep that in mind. This is not a universally unique one-time only ID. This ID gets reused. So keep that in mind. But usually, when you're looking at a single um, um, uh, session, the IDs are unique. But again, keep in mind they can get reused. This ID is also unique at a given time, and it is the thread ID within the process. So sometimes it's important to notice that different threads are doing different things. So you can see, for example, the process ID here is different from the thread ID, which means this is not the main thread. But that is technicality. Keep that in mind. And then you have the date and time. It's straightforward. You have the time zone. Again, sometimes this is relevant to keep in mind where this instance is running. And then you have this bracket. The bracket tells you the name of the thread. Okay. So we give most threads unique names. And this is very important because for documents, we name the documents and we give them um, unique serial ID. This ID is a hexadecimal number. It has no special meaning. It's just a number that we increment for every document for a given session. Basically, every time you run or you start the service, we start from 001. Okay, so you can differentiate the documents this way. So for example, if I search for 001, I will find all of the related log entries, right? Because all of the 001 document specific entries will be like this. And actually I can show you 1 second. Maybe I can show you a different. No, this one is not very useful. Yeah, here. This is another session, and if I search for 001, I will see that I have doc broker 001 as well as kit bgsv 001, right? And what this means that all these log lines, they belong to the same document. But careful. If you look here, you will see that the domains are different, and you will see that the process IDs are different, and of course, the thread IDs are also different, right? And what this tells you, these are different processes. The kit process is where the document is, and the WSD process is the service. Okay, and so this is the part that communicates with the client. It's the part of the service that is tracking the document and the document state, and this is the actual document. One more detail is that here this tells you that this is the background save uh, instance. So if we search further down, you will see that we have kit broker under 001, and you have kit bg sv 001. What this means, and again, look on the left, you will see that the domain is kit for these kit broker and kit BG but the doc broker is WSD, right? So these are actually um, three different domains, if you will. I shouldn't confuse you by saying by reusing domain maybe. Um, what this implies is that this is where the document is. This is where we are saving the document in the background, and this is the document's state in the service. Okay, so it's very important to differentiate between them. And obviously, once you know that where the document is always starts with kit broker under, you can grep for them, and doc broker under is where we have the document state in the service, and the number will tell you which document it is. Now, to find more information about the document, you can actually try and search with this 001, and you will find more information about the document. So let me actually. I'm wondering. Unfortunately, this is a partial log, which makes it slightly challenging. At any rate, um, the other component of logs is the log level, and you see the log level here. Um, the highest level, which is the most verbose, is trace, and it is abbreviated as capital TRC here. And debug DBG is the one less verbose level. And then we have information, inf, warning, WRN, and error, which is ERR, and we can find it like this. By default, in the config file, the log level is warning. Here it's a variable because this is generated at build time, but you know it's typically warning. Notice is equivalent to information, by the way, so it's not really used. Critical and fatal are used, but they're synonymous with something horrible happened, and I'm basically going to exit the process. So it's one of those things you might see at the end of a log when things went bad. So by default, we only log warnings and more critical levels. So it's warning, error, critical, fatal. So we are missing information, debug, and trace. And this is important because most of the information in the logs are at a lower level, sorry, a higher level, I should say, which means that uh, it is missing by default. So you wouldn't see all these activities that we see here. All of this is going to be missing by default. And if you are investigating an issue, the first thing you want to do is you want to try to reproduce the issue with a higher level. You want to go to trace if possible. The only problem with that is that it's going to generate a lot of logs, and that has, three downsides that we have to be aware of. One is that it's going to slow down the service. It's not free. It's not cheap to generate all these thousands or indeed millions of lines of logs. The other downside is that it will start filling the disk because this information is being written somewhere, and it's going to take some disk space, and you can easily have gigabytes of logs within a couple of hours, maybe, if potentially less than that. The last is not obvious, but I have to mention it because if you spend any amount of time reading logs, you will have to be mindful of that, which is reading millions of lines of logs takes a lot of time. And it is not cheap in the sense of the time spent. to analyze the logs. So you don't want more information than you need. If you can trace a problem with information level logging, then that's the first thing you should do. If you think information is going to give you enough information, I apologize for the pun, then that's the level you want, and it's not going to be a lot of logs. It's going to be fine, and the impact on performance is negligible, meaning you can ignore it pretty much. Especially if it is for a couple of hours to reproduce the issue, you're good. The next level is debug, and in pretty much all the cases, debug will be sufficient to tell you or tell us if we are investigating what the problem is. It is rare that you would need trace, but that does happen. And if you're in doubt, and if it's easy to reproduce a problem, then and if it is in a test environment, by all means, suggest or go ahead and you yourself use trace, and that's going to give the most information. And again, if the amount of logging is not too much because it's easy to reproduce, then that's fine. That's what we should use. Now, speaking about logging and configuration, it is very important to be aware of disabled areas. We have by default some areas that don't log or don't generate logs in the code. These areas are socket related activity, WebSocket related activity, admin, and pixel manipulation. This can be extended, as you can see here, and you can also delete or reduce these if you want to see logs coming from these. But be mindful that the amount of logging is going to increase significantly, because obviously sockets and pixel manipulation is something that happens um, while a document is being viewed or edited. So the amount of log is going to increase significantly, especially if you have trace level logging enabled. So it can get really, really overwhelming. Now, the next thing to keep in mind is this most verbose level settable from client. This can be extremely useful. Unfortunately, um, this is not often used in my experience, and I think it's a lost opportunity. What this does is you can set the maximum level of logging that you want to allow an administrator to change the log level from the admin console. So there is an admin console, and while the service is running, you can open the admin console in the browser and you can change the log level at runtime. But it wouldn't let you go higher than these configured levels, right? The least is the least and the most is the most, right? So it's going to bound them between these two configurations, meaning if here the highest level is notice, which we said it's equivalent to information pretty much, it won't let you go to debug and trace from the admin console. If you need debug or trace, you need to stop the service, change this line here, and then start the service again. Obviously, when you stop the service, you interrupt the document editing and viewing, so that is not um, something that we prefer to do. So it is much better to have the foresight and maybe have this set to debug or potentially trace. So if you need, as an administrator, you can go in from the console without restarting your service and simply change the log setting, reproduce the issue, or maybe observe for a while the users continue using the documents as they normally do, and then you can reduce the log level back to its previous value, and now you have valuable logs that you can use to investigate or open a ticket, etc. um, the other thing to keep in mind is file logging. Again, in many cases file logging is not enabled, and that's fine. The logs go to the journal, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, the journal has a limit to how much logging a process can make before it drops logs. So, for example, if you set the log level to trace, we will start generating a large amount of logs. And in that case, if you're not logging to a file, they will go to the system journal, and the system journal will start dropping the logs, because if it notices that you're generating thousands of log lines per second, it's not going to store them, and it will simply delete them. All right, so that's not helpful. In fact, that's just even worse than having a lower level logging, because now you lost, all the logs for that period that it dropped. The trick is, for higher level logging, you almost always want file logging, because the journal is going to drop them almost certainly after a certain point, and that's not helpful. When you enable file logging, you have to specify a file path that is valid, that the process account can write to. This is important because, again, if you give here a path that this the cool WSD process cannot write to, logging will fail. It just will fail, and you won't have any logging output at all. So that's not great. The other thing to keep in mind, that you have other settings here. Um, I strongly suggest not to change them without understanding what they do, because I have seen cases that these settings were very, very broken. Let me give you an example. Uh, sorry. If you set rotation, if you enable rotation, and you set the um, hold on one second. Yeah, by default we don't have the size, but I have seen cases where the size was set. That's interesting that it's not here by default. At any rate, if you start changing these settings, and, for example, enable rotation, you might you might have surprises that are not great. Um, for example, if you have a document that is long running, and it is logging to a file, and then we rotate the file, that document will not be able to log to the new file because it doesn't know about it. So there are gotchas that you have to be very, very careful about. So I suggest not to touch these settings unless you really know what you're doing. Another thing is, if you change, the purge age and make it something very small, then the logs will get deleted very quickly. Instead of 10 days, it's going to get deleted. Maybe if you set this to 1 hour, it's going to get deleted every 1 hour. So you wouldn't have any logs more than 1 hour. Again, it's useless. So just be careful when you touch these settings. But enabling file logging is fine, especially if you're doing trace level logging. Again, I want to take a pause. I've been talking for about 40 minutes, and I want to see if there are any questions. There's one more thing I want to add, um, but I think we can stop in another few minutes unless there are questions.
Ash, can you look at the chat, please? Looks like Timur has a question.
Which chat is that? I'm sorry.
He says, where is sub for kit?
Where is what? I didn't catch it.
Sub for kit. It's in in the GTIP chat.
About domains, you said there are three domains, but with the new architecture where sub forkit is also introduced, does it have its own somehow domain, or it's under the forkit?
I'm not sure what the new architecture is, and I missed what has a new domain. But we only have forkit, FRK, we have kit, and WSD. These are the three different groups of processes that we have. So if you see kit, it is always the kit process or a forked version of it, like in the case of background saving. If you see FRK, it is always the fork kit. And if you see WSD, it is always the WSD process. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's about
It's it,
my question is from Kaylan's presentation about the server-side settings, where instead of the let's say 3 levels, there are now another sub-port that was related to that.
Yeah, that doesn't change. That doesn't change the domains. By the way, your voice is extremely, extremely low and very, very difficult to hear. But no, the way we create these processes and whether we have mounting enabled or namespaces or not, they don't change the fact that we have three groups of processes with three different responsibilities. That doesn't change. And even the background saving, it's still a kit instance, so it is, it's still a kit. It is important to know these domains because sometimes you can get a log entry that you're not sure, where is this coming from. It's important to have a mental picture of where it is in the general architecture. Is this, document level, or is this the service level, right? The WSD. And these two are the main ones, and forkit is in the middle, basically creating new kit instances. This is why I mention it, because for me this is the first thing I check, right? If I want to know where this log is coming from, that's the first thing I want to know, right? Is it the kit, is it the forkit, is it WSD? Because if I'm looking at an issue in the document and I see forkit is complaining of something, that I don't care about that, right? And if I see WSD is complaining from something, then I need to see here in the brackets what is the thread ID. Like for example, if I'm interested in document activity, I want to see doc broker, right? If I see something else, then that might not be interesting. Like I might see um actually I can't remember the name here. I can see, for example, the web service, the accepts poll. These are threads that do communication with the clients in terms of accepting connections and so on. So again, it depends on what kind of problem I'm interested in. And if the problem is related to, I want to find out what was the original request coming on the connection, then I want to look in the web server poll, and that's what I'm going to grep for, right? And that's something I do very frequently. So for example, um, client, no, we don't have it. Actually, let me try from the top. No, again, this is incomplete. And here I haven't created documents, so we wouldn't see it. Um, so yeah, this is why it's really important to be able to look at these values, even if you don't, even if you don't know what they are. It's important to keep in mind that this is indicating something. And as I said, this is the name of the thread, and it tells you which part of the logic is the one logging. Another thing to mention is these numbers with the hashtag. These are the socket FDs. So if you know, for example, that a certain connection is the one you're interested in, you can trace it by searching for the same hashtag. So, for example, in this case, suppose I want to see what happened with 16, and you can see 16 here is it has handling accepted, and then if you go further down, you can see accepted, and you have more details, etc. And you can trace it all the way from created to the fact that it is being pulled and it's still active apparently, so it's not closed. In other cases, you will see closed. See 24. is closed after reading result, blah blah blah, and you see it's disconnected, right? So this is how you can trace it. So if I want to search 24 and see what it was doing, I can go back, and until I find the source. In fact, I can already see what it was. This is the a request that is trying to read the hosting capabilities, which is something that is done regularly. So if we go um, to the top, sorry, to the top, we will see that it begins here when we're accepting it, and you should be able to see all the details you want. And here is the request, and then you will see that it is being serviced, etc. And then we close the connection, right? Questions?
I would have a question. On the
Sure.
core side, there is this feature, this side debug macro, which is for throw away login. So it's some kind of login that you locally add, you never commit to get, but it's a specific area, so you can easily search for it and so on. Um, if I understand correctly, we don't really have something like that on the online side. Is there some reason that that's not useful in this context, or this is could be added, just nobody did the work, or
So that's a very good question. That was the last thing that I had in mind when I said there's one more thing I want to mention. So you're talking about these cell log, and these are loggings that are enabled in core, um, that are specific to a document, basically. Well, if you enable it here, it's going to be enabled for all the documents. Um, in the config, there is an entry called locate sal log, and you can see that it does have the ability to set this value. So indeed, somebody did the work, and this exists, and you can set it in the log. Sorry, in the config to enable it, and
that's that's fine. It's not exactly what I was asking. On top of these existing log lines in the code, info and warning, there is a debug level, which is something we have a bit hook. You can't commit code, which would use the debug level. And then this can be used locally as you develop and debug as a separate level, which is definitely your own logging specific to some problem you are working on because it's not used anywhere. And the question was, would it make sense to have something like that in the online side?
ah, I see, I see. Well, I guess we can extend the areas, and you can have your own area. Is that's what you're suggesting? So this
Yeah,
disabled
something like
areas,
that. Yeah, a
we
level
can,
or area or something that you can
yeah.
filter for.
Right, right, right. I see what you're saying, Miklos. This is a good idea. So we can have temporary or custom or private areas or something, and you can, by default they're disabled unless and until somebody enables them, and it's only for a special use case. Yeah, I guess nobody did that work. We have these areas that are for permanent and I want to say major parts of the logic, like storage, like sockets, etc. But we don't have the temporary private ones that you're talking about. That's a really good idea, I think.
Okay. The question was just like if there is a reason why that's not there or just nobody did it. But
Because nobody did the work, I
yeah,
think.
okay,
I mean, yeah,
fine.
we have to be careful. If it's not done right, it can also be disruptive, right? It has to be done in a way that is by default disabled, and it has to be clear that this is a private one. It's You shouldn't expect it to get logged by default, right? Otherwise people will get confused. If you're reading a log line and you expect to see it in the logs and you don't see it, right? Because it is private, but there's no indication that it is private because it looks identical to all the other ones. you're gonna, drive yourself or somebody else crazy, right? So it has to be done in a way that's clear, that's explicit, and disabled by default, so it wouldn't have any impact on other people or indeed production. But other than that, I think, it's an idea that seems reasonable and not too hard to implement. Just need
Okay,
somebody to
thanks.
do the work. Thank you. Um, okay, so I want to continue this, maybe a couple of minutes on it. This sal log enables logging in core, and as I was showing here, indeed there is a way to do that from the logs. Um, just be careful that if you enable this, it's going to generate quite a bit of logs. I'm gonna show you here again. I'm doing it from my environment. It is equivalent to changing here. I'm not changing the config simply because because in my development environment, I want to make sure that nothing overrides it, etc. But effectively, it is the same. I just want to show you very quickly that when we do this, we will get more information, and this is it. Already, you can see um, you will get vastly more information depending on what you enable and what if it's debug level, or indeed there are areas there that you can enable and disable. But you can see in the default debug that enables all of the areas, um, it's going to log a tremendous amount of information. And in between, you see WSD is logging, right? And the format is different for these logs, right? And this is something that can be used when we're investigating an issue. Maybe we're trying to reproduce it, and we need to understand what's happening in the document process level, not just the web service or the WSD service. Okay,
Thank you,
questions?
Thank you, Ashod. Okay, questions, Attila,
Thank you. No questions.
Maven.
Yes, a question. Something I feel like is lacking is life showing just a life cycle of a document in info level. Like by life cycle, I mean like showing
Yeah,
when
I know
the
what you mean.
file is fetched from WOPI, when the file is saved, finally, or I'm not
Yeah,
sure. Well, I feel like we just are missing some formalized steps that are really regular, because sometimes I cannot see from the logs whether it's an issue with the browser or with the WordPress server, for instance.
yeah. No, I agree with you in that we don't have standardized messages that we can maybe put in some documentation, where if you find them, that the document started here, the document ended there. And I think that will be very helpful. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is we almost certainly log at information level key activities. It's just that it's very hard to specify what is beginning and what is end. Let me give you an example. Is the document beginning when the first user tries to load it? And if yes, then is it when we receive the HTTP request, or is it when we authenticate the user, or is it when we download the document, or is it when we create the doc broker, or is it when we create the kit, or is it when you get the idea? You see what I'm saying? So it
Yeah, but
depends on
I'm not
what you're
so much
interested in.
interested in when things are starting and ending, but rather the current state of affairs. Like, yes, the document is open and now new users are coming to it. And I just want a message that said something like kind of clear without the noise of or having to see connections or things like that.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Um, yeah, I guess at information level we could do that. But information level already logs similar things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I see
How
what
do
you
you
mean.
need
I
to
see what you
combine
mean.
things,
You want just a state. You want a
yeah.
single log just the state, maybe a summary of the state that
Yeah. And so that we can
in the
trace
lifetime,
the
right?
log.
Whenever a new view is connected, whenever we're saving. Yeah, yeah, understood. The way I trace it, by the way, is by, I know the log entries that do various things, and I know how to grep for them and filter for them, and that's how I do it. It's more detailed, it's more work as well, but it gives me the maximum accuracy, right? Because I know
Sure.
exactly where it is in the code,
Sure.
etc. But yeah, I
But
mean, this is generally a good idea. Generally, it's a good idea.
because my use case is mostly like customers, they didn't have debug level or even info level enabled on their system, and they report their logs before because they didn't change the log level, or they haven't thought about it or whatever. And if we can draw some amount of conclusion from the get-go, it's quite valuable for support.
Yeah, but keep in mind that you
That's my
wouldn't
main
be
use
able
case.
to log that level of information if warning is enabled. Otherwise, it would be, fighting with the
Yeah,
admin,
sure.
right? If the admin doesn't want to see detailed information and you start
Sure.
logging it, it's just not going to